Welcome back, dear listener, to Quiet Centuries, where histories are told softly for the longest nights. Settle now into whatever stillness you have made for yourself this evening. Let the lamp grow dim, let the room cool around you, let the small weight of the day slip down from your shoulders one quiet inch at a time. Let your hands grow heavy where they rest. Let the breath that has been hurrying all day slow itself, all on its own, until it moves the way a tide moves. In and then out. In and then out, asking nothing of you at all. Tonight we are going to walk, slowly and without any hurry at all, through the entire long life of a man the world came to call Blackbeard. We are going to follow him from the smoky harbour towns of England, where he may have been born, somewhere around the year 1680, out across the wide grey water of the Atlantic, into the warm green islands of the Caribbean, and at last to the shallow brown sounds of Carolina, where the story ends. We will take it all very slowly, very slowly, very slowly, because there is no part of his life we need to reach in a hurry, and because the slowness itself is the point. The candle does not race to the bottom of the wick, the tide does not run to be finished with the shore, and tonight neither will we. You may have heard his name before. Almost everyone has. It comes to us wrapped in smoke and legend, in stories of a giant of a man with a black beard knotted in ribbons, with slow burning fuses smouldering beneath the brim of his hat, with a brace of pistols slung across his chest and a cutlass in his hand. That image is part of the truth and part of the painting that men laid over the truth afterward, the way varnish is laid over an old portrait until you cannot quite tell the face from the gloss. Tonight, gently, we will try to lift a little of that varnish and look at the man underneath, the sailor who lived and worked and schemed and died in only a handful of years, and who has somehow gone on living in our imagination for more than 300 of them. His real name, most likely, was Edward. Edward Thatch, the records most often say, though the same man appears in old papers as Teach, and as Thatch, and as Tatch, and as half a dozen other spellings besides, because in those days a name was a sound first and a written thing only second, and a clerk simply wrote down what his ear had caught. So let us call him Edward Thatch, and let us begin, as all lives begin, before he had done anything at all, before there was any beard or any black flag, when he was only a child in a loud and salt-smelling town, watching the ships come in. Picture then a port town in the west of England, somewhere around the close of the 1600s, in the years when Edward Thatch would have been very small. The town is most likely Bristol, a city built on the river and on the trade that the river carried, a place crowded with masts and ropes and barrels and shouting, where the smell of tar and fish and wood smoke hung over the rooftops from morning until night. Imagine the grey stone houses leaning close together over narrow streets. Imagine the river thick with vessels, the small ones nosing in among the great ones, the gulls turning slow circles in a pale sky. Imagine the constant sound of it, the creak of timber, the slap of water against hulls, the cry of men selling and men loading, and men cursing the weight of the world they carried on their backs. Into a world like that, a boy was born, and given the name Edward, and grew up with the sea always within hearing. We know almost nothing certain about those first years. That is the honest truth of it, and it is worth saying plainly, because so much of what is told about Blackbeard was invented later, by men who wanted a better story than the one the dull facts gave them. We do not know the day he was born. We do not know the names of his mother and father with any certainty. We do not know whether his family was poor or comfortable, whether he could read and write, what he believed about God or about himself. Some who knew him later said he was a man of some education, that he could write a fair hand and speak well when he chose to, and that suggests a boy who was taught his letters, a boy from a family that was not at the very bottom of the world. But we are guessing gently in the soft grey way one guesses at the shape of furniture in a dark room. The childhood of Edward Thatch is a quiet, unlit place, and we will not pretend to light it more brightly than it can be lit. What we can say is what that world would have given him, simply by being the world it was, A boy growing up in Bristol at the end of the 17th century grew up inside the greatest sea-trading nation of its time. The ships that crowded that river went out to every corner of the known world and came back heavy. They carried wool and cloth and iron out, and they brought sugar and tobacco and rum and dye and 100 other things back. And they carried, too, in those same hulls, the cruel and enormous traffic in enslaved human beings that ran like a dark thread through all of it, a thing the men of that age spoke of as ordinary commerce, and that we, looking back, can only speak of as a great and terrible wrong. A boy on those docks breathed all of it in. He learned, without anyone sitting him down to teach it, that the sea was where money was made and lives were spent, that a man with skill and nerve could rise from nothing, and that the world rewarded boldness and forgave a great deal in those who succeeded. These were the lessons of the harbour, and Edward Thatch learnt them young. And so, in the slow and ordinary way of such things, he went to sea. We do not know exactly when, or in what ship, or whether he ran to it joyfully or was driven to it by need. But somewhere in his youth, Edward Thatch became a sailor, one more young man among the thousands who climbed the rigging and hauled the lines and slept in the cramped and stinking dark below the deck, learning the long hard trade of the ocean. And here, dear listener, before we follow him out onto that ocean, let me say a word about what kind of telling this is going to be, so that you can let go of any worry about keeping up. This is a channel for the longest nights, for the hours when sleep will not come on its own and the mind keeps turning over the day. If you find, as we go, that a name slips past you, or that you lose the thread of where a ship was sailing, you must not reach after it. You are not here to remember. You are here to drift. The whole of Blackbeard's life is going to pass before you tonight like a slow procession seen from a warm window, and you are free to close your eyes at any point along the way and simply let the procession go on without you. If this gentle, unhurried kind of history is the company you would like on the long nights to come, you might let the channel know you are here, quietly, by subscribing, so that more of these slow tellings can find their way to you when the dark is wide and you would rather not be awake in it alone. And that is the only time I will ask. Now, settle deeper and let us go back to the sea. The sea that Edward Thatch went out upon was not yet the sea of pirates. Not for him, not at first. The young Thatch most likely learned his trade in the merchant service. And then, when the time came, in the navy of his king, for these were the years of a great war. Across the turn of the century, England and much of Europe were locked in the long struggle that the history books call the War of the Spanish Succession, a war fought over who should sit on the throne of Spain and, beneath that, over trade and empire and the riches of the New World. It was a war fought as much at sea as on land, and it pulled tens of thousands of ordinary men onto ships and sent them across the Atlantic to the warm waters of the Caribbean, where the great powers had their sugar islands and their treasure fleets and their endless quarrels. In that war, a particular kind of sailor came into his own, and that sailor was called the privateer. A privateer was not quite a pirate, though to the men on the receiving end the difference might have been hard to feel. A privateer was a private sailor in a private ship who carried a piece of paper from his government. A letter of marque it was called. That gave him permission to attack and rob the ships of the enemy nation. He kept a share of what he took, and his government kept a share, and the whole arrangement was a way of waging war cheaply, by turning loose men's greed against the enemy and paying them out of the enemy's own pockets. It was legal robbery, sanctioned plunder, and it was enormously attractive to a bold young sailor, because the rewards could be very great, and the work, while dangerous, was the kind of danger such men were already living with anyway. Edward Thatch, most accounts agree, served aboard privateers in this war, sailing out of the island of Jamaica, which was then a great English base in the Caribbean, a crowded, sun-blasted, hard drinking place where the privateers gathered between voyages. We have no log of his particular deeds in those years, no list of the ships he helped to take, but we can be confident of the kind of life he was living, and of the kind of man it was shaping him into. He was learning to fight at sea. He was learning to handle a ship in the close and deadly work of bringing her alongside another vessel, of grappling the two hulls together. of swarming across with cutlass and pistol, while the great guns roared and the smoke rolled across the water. He was learning to lead other men, or at least to be the kind of man other men would follow into that smoke. And he was learning, too, the deep and dangerous lesson that this work, this taking of other men's ships and other men's goods by force, could make a poor man rich, and could do it fast. For a time, all of that was lawful, blessed by the king's paper, aimed only at the enemies of England. But wars end, and when this war ended in the year 1713 with the great treaty that men called the Peace of Utrecht, something happened that would change the whole story of the Caribbean, and would open the door through which Edward Thatch and many men like him were about to walk. Imagine it from their side. For more than a decade, thousands of hard, capable, violent men had been paid to rob ships and reward boldness. They had grown used to a life of risk and plunder and the loose, lawless freedom of the privateer's deck. And then, almost overnight, the war was over, and the paper that made their work lawful was worthless, and they were no longer wanted. The navies that had swollen to fight the war shrank again, and turned their men loose ashore with little pay and less thanks. The privateers found their letters of marque cancelled, their living gone. They were skilled in only one thing, the taking of ships by force, and now there was no lawful taking to be done. Picture then the harbours of the Caribbean in those years just after the peace, crowded with idle, restless, dangerous men. Men who knew exactly how to seize a vessel and divide her cargo. Men who had been told for years that such work was honourable, and who were now told, suddenly, that it was a crime. It is no great mystery what happened next. A great many of them simply went on doing what they had always done, only now without the paper, without the blessing, without the careful aiming at a single enemy nation. They became, in the plainest sense of the word, pirates. They took whatever ship they could catch, of whatever flag, and they kept it all for themselves. And the years that followed, from about 1714 to about 1722, became what later writers would call the Golden Age of piracy, the brief, bright, savage flowering of sea robbery in the West Indies and along the American coast. It is in this short window, this handful of crowded years, that the whole career of Blackbeard takes place. He was not a pirate of all his life. He was a pirate, it seems, for only about 2 years at the very end of it. But what years they were! Now, to understand where Edward Thatch went when the war ended and the men scattered into outlawry, we must speak of a particular place, a place that became the beating heart of this golden age, a place whose name was, for a few years, a byword for lawlessness all across the Atlantic. That place was an island called New Providence, and the town upon it called Nassau, in the cluster of islands men called the Bahamas, lying just off the coast of Spanish Florida, athwart the great sea lanes by which the treasure of the New World was carried home to Europe. Let us go there, slowly, in our imagination, for it is the world in which Thatch became Blackbeard. Picture a low, hot, sandy island under a hard blue sky, fringed with pale beaches and clear, shallow water that runs from turquoise to deep blue as the bottom falls away. Picture a wide, curved harbour, sheltered and easy to defend, deep enough for the small, swift ships the pirates favoured, but too shallow for the great warships that might come to root them out. Picture a ramshackle town strung along the shore, hardly a town at all by the measure of England, a scatter of huts and tents and rough houses, sailcloth stretched on poles for shade, the whole place reeking of rum and rotting fish and wood smoke and the sweat of men who did not wash. Picture the harbour full of stolen ships, and the beach full of men careening those ships, hauling them over on their sides to scrape the weed and barnacles from their hulls. Picture, everywhere, the men themselves, hundreds and then thousands of them, drinking, gambling, fighting, sleeping in the shade, men of every nation and colour, English and French and Dutch, escaped servants and runaway slaves, deserters from the navy and castaways from wrecks. All of them gathered in this one wild place because here, and almost nowhere else, no king's law could reach them. For a few years, Nassau was something the modern world finds hard to imagine. It was a town with no governor, no court, no jail, no church that anyone heeded, no authority but the rough self-rule of armed and dangerous men. The pirates called it, half in jest, their republic. They made their own loose agreements, governed their ships by their own articles, divided their plunder by their own customs, and answered to no crown at all. It could not last, and it did not last, but while it lasted it drew to itself the boldest and the worst and the most desperate men of the age, and among them, sometime around the year 1716, came Edward Thatch. He did not come as a captain. He came, the accounts tell us, as a follower of another man, a more famous pirate of that moment, a captain named Benjamin Hornigold. And here, before Thatch steps fully into his own story, we should pause on Hornigold, because the older man shaped the younger one, and because the relationship between them tells us something gentle and surprising about the kind of pirate Blackbeard was, at the beginning, before the legend grew around him. Benjamin Hornigold was, by the standards of that lawless harbour, almost a respectable man, if such a word can be used at all. He was an Englishman, a former privateer like so many others, and he had become one of the leading captains of the Nassau pirates. But Hornigold clung, for a long while, to a strange scruple, a line he would not cross. He would rob the ships of France and of Spain, the old enemies, freely and gladly, but he would not, for a long time, attack a ship that flew the flag of England. He still thought of himself, in some corner of his mind, as an Englishman at war with England's enemies, even though the war was over and his paper was gone. He was a pirate who still believed he was a patriot, and that belief made him, in the end, too cautious for the men he led, who cared nothing for old loyalties and only wanted to take whatever ship was richest, whatever flag she flew. It was under this man, Benjamin Hornigold, that Edward Thatch first learned the pirates' trade in earnest, and learned it so well and so quickly that Hornigold soon gave him a command of his own. Thatch was given a captured sloop, a small fast single-masted vessel of the kind the pirates loved for its speed and its shallow draught, and put in charge of her and her crew. And from that moment, Edward Thatch was no longer merely a sailor, no longer merely a follower. He was a captain. The man who would become Blackbeard had taken the first step onto the deck that would carry him into legend. We do not know precisely when the great Blackbeard first grew, or when the man began to be called by the name we know him by. These things came on gradually, the way a reputation grows, the way a story thickens in the telling. But somewhere in these months, sailing under Hornigold, and then increasingly on his own account, Edward Thatch began to become Blackbeard. And to understand how that happened, we must understand the most important thing about him, the thing that set him apart from the merely brutal men around him, the thing that made him not just a pirate, but a kind of dark performance, a piece of living theatre. Blackbeard understood, in a way that few of his rough fellows did, that the greatest weapon a pirate could carry was not his cutlass or his cannon, but his reputation. He understood fear. And he set about, deliberately and cleverly, to make himself the most frightening thing on the sea. Picture him as the men who faced him described him. He was a tall man, and strong, and that alone would have set him apart in a crowd. But it was the beard that men remembered, a great black beard that grew up almost to his eyes and hung down upon his chest, a wild and enormous thing such as no ordinary man wore. And he did not simply let it grow. He tended it the way a strange gardener tends a strange and terrible plant. He braided it into many small braids, the accounts say, and tied them up with little ribbons, and twisted some of the ends back behind his ears, so that the whole black mass of it framed his face like something out of a nightmare. And then, in the moment of battle, when he meant to terrify the men he was about to rob, he did the thing that more than anything else burned his image into the memory of the age. He took lengths of slow match, the smouldering cord that gunners use to fire cannon, the kind that burns slowly and steadily with a red coal and a thread of smoke, and he tucked these under the brim of his hat and into his hair and his beard, and lit them, so that he came at his victims wreathed in slow-drifting smoke, his eyes burning out of a cloud of it, looking, as one terrified witness put it, like the very devil come up out of hell. Across his chest he wore a sling holding 3 braces of pistols, 6 guns at the ready, and at his side a heavy cutlass, and the whole assembled figure of him, the smoke, the beard, the guns. The great dark looming size of him was a thing carefully built to do one job and do it perfectly. It was built to make men give up without a fight. And that, dear listener, is the gentle and surprising truth at the centre of Blackbeard's whole career, the truth that the bloody legend almost buries. For all the terror he inspired, for all the smoke and the pistols and the devil's face, there is, in the careful record of his deeds, remarkably little blood. When his story is examined closely, by the people who have spent their lives examining such things, a strange picture emerges. Blackbeard, the most feared pirate of his age, the very image of murder and cruelty, does not appear, in fact, to have killed very many people at all, until the very last day of his life. His whole method, his genius if we can call it that, was to make killing unnecessary. He built a face so frightening that men surrendered before a shot was fired, handed over their cargo, and were let go to spread the story of the terror they had seen, so that the next ship would surrender even faster. The fear did the work. The fear was the weapon, and the beard and the smoke and the pistols were the careful, theatrical, almost playful means of manufacturing that fear. There is something almost gentle in the realization, something that softens the monster a little. He was a frightening man, but he was, above all, a clever one, who had understood that a reputation, properly tended, could do what cannon could not, and could do it without the cost. Let us return then to the warm green water and the slow unfolding of his rise. In those first months as a captain under Hornigold, Thatch and his patrons sailed and raided together, taking ships among the islands and along the coast, building up their little fleet and their reputation. The pirates of that age did not, as a rule, sail alone if they could help it. They gathered in loose companies, several ships sailing in consort, because a cluster of ships could overwhelm a stronger prey, and because there was a kind of safety in numbers in a world where every man's hand was against them. And so for a time Thatch was one captain among several in Hornigold's company, learning, taking, growing in skill and in the trust of his men. But the partnership with Hornigold could not last, and the reason it ended tells us, again, something about the changing world the pirates lived in. Hornigold, as we have said, still clung to his old scruple, his refusal to attack English ships, and his men grew tired of it. They watched fat English merchantmen sail past, untouched, because of their captain's strange loyalty to a king who had declared them all outlaws. They wanted the richest prizes, and the richest prizes did not always fly the French or Spanish flag. And so at last the crews rose up in the loose democratic way of pirate companies, where a captain held his place only so long as the men chose to follow him, and they voted Hornigold out of his command. They would no longer sail under a man who tied their hands. Thatch, by all accounts, did not share his old patron's scruple. He would take any ship, of any flag, and that willingness made him the natural leader for the men who had grown impatient with the older way. And so Edward Thatch stepped fully out from under Benjamin Hornigold's shadow and took command in his own right, with his own ship and his own crew, free now to make his own legend. Hornigold himself, we may note in passing, met a quieter end than most of his trade. Not long after this, the British Crown offered the pirates of Nassau a pardon, a chance to give up their lawless life and return to the king's peace without punishment, and Benjamin Hornigold took it. He laid down his black trade, accepted the king's mercy, and then, in one of the strange turns this history is full of, became a pirate hunter himself, sailing out under government authority to chase down his former fellows. He was, in the end, the kind of man who needed to believe he served some authority larger than himself, and when the chance came to serve the king again, even against his old friends, he took it gladly. He was later lost at sea in a hurricane, and the water closed over him without much notice. But by then, his pupil had long outgrown him. Now we come to the great turning point of Blackbeard's career, the moment when he ceased to be merely one capable pirate captain among many and became something larger, the most powerful and feared pirate on the whole American coast. And it came, as such things often do, in the form of a single ship, a particular vessel that fell into his hands and that he made the instrument of his greatness. It happened late in the year 1717, off the island of St. Vincent, in the eastern Caribbean. Thatch, sailing with his small company, came upon a large French merchant ship. She was a slave ship, a vessel built for the dreadful Atlantic crossing that carried enslaved Africans to the plantations of the New World, and she was called, in her own French tongue, La Concorde. She was a big vessel, much larger than the little sloops the pirates usually sailed, broad and deep and strong, built to carry a great cargo across the open ocean. And when Thatch attacked her, he found her weakened, her crew sick and reduced by the long brutal voyage from Africa, in no condition to put up a real fight. She surrendered, and Edward Thatch, looking at the great ship he had taken, made a decision that would change everything. He would not simply rob her and let her go. He would keep her. He would make her his own. He took the ship to a quiet anchorage, and there he set about transforming her from a merchant vessel into a man of war. He cut new gun ports into her sides and mounted cannon, many cannon, until she carried, the accounts say, some 40 guns, a fearsome armament that put her on a level with the warships of a navy. He chose the strongest and most willing of the men he found aboard, and let the rest go, and he kept, too, some of the enslaved Africans he found in her hold, a number of whom became part of his crew and sailed and fought alongside him. For the pirate world, brutal as it was, drew its men from everywhere, and sometimes offered to a man who had been chattel a strange and bitter measure of freedom he could find nowhere else. And when the great ship was remade, bristling with guns, crowded with men, fast and strong and terrible, Blackbeard gave her a new name. He called her the Queen Anne's Revenge. It is a curious name, and worth dwelling on for a quiet moment, because it tells us something about the mind of the man. Queen Anne was the English queen during the Great War that had ended a few years before, the war in which Thatch had served as a privateer, and she had died in the year 1714. To call his pirate flagship the Queen Anne's Revenge was to reach back to those privateering days, to the time when his violence had been lawful and even patriotic, and to wrap his new outlawry in a kind of nostalgic memory of that lost legitimacy. There may have been politics in it, too, for these were years when many in Britain were unhappy with the new king who had come to the throne after Anne, and a name like that could carry a whisper of old loyalties and old grievances. But whatever was in his mind, the name stuck, and the Queen Anne's Revenge became for the next several months the most feared ship on the Western Ocean, the floating fortress at the head of Blackbeard's growing fleet. With this great ship beneath him, Blackbeard's power swelled. He no longer needed to fear all but the largest warships. The Queen Anne's Revenge could overwhelm almost anything she met, and the sight of her alone, with the smoking, ribboned, pistol-hung figure of her captain on the deck, was often enough to make a merchant strike his colours without a fight. Blackbeard gathered other ships and other captains around him, a small fleet of consorts, and ranged up and down the sea lanes, taking prize after prize. He sailed through the islands, and then north along the coast of the American mainland, where the busy ports of the English colonies sent out a steady stream of merchant ships laden with goods. He was, in those months at the very height of his powers, a sea king without a crown, ranging where he pleased, taking what he wished, his name running ahead of him like a cold wind, emptying the courage out of every captain who heard it. And it is here, at the height of his career, that we come to the single most famous and most audacious thing that Blackbeard ever did, the deed that more than any other fixed his name in the memory of the world. In the late spring of the year 1718, Blackbeard brought his fleet to the coast of the colony of South Carolina and to the mouth of the harbour of its principal town, the wealthy and busy port of Charleston, which men then often called Charlestown. And there, in the full light of day, with a boldness that takes the breath away even at this distance of 300 years, he did something no pirate had ever quite dared to do. He blockaded the city. Let us imagine it slowly, for it is a remarkable scene. Charleston was one of the richest ports in all of England's American colonies, a place grown fat on rice and skins and the trade of the southern plantations. Its harbour was the throat through which all that wealth passed, in and out, on its way to the wider world. And across that throat, one morning, Blackbeard simply placed his fleet. The Queen Anne's Revenge and her consorts took station off the harbour bar, and they began to seize every ship that tried to come in or go out. Vessel after vessel fell into their hands, some of them carrying wealthy and important passengers, leading citizens of the colony, members of its council. The whole commerce of the city ground to a halt. The wealthiest port of the south was held hostage by a single pirate fleet, in full view of the helpless town, and there was nothing the people of Charleston could do about it, for they had no warships of their own to drive the pirates off. And then Blackbeard made his demand, and the demand reveals, once again, the strange and almost human texture of the man. He did not ask for gold. He did not ask for treasure or for ransom in coin. He sent word ashore that he was holding his prisoners, including some of the city's leading men, and that they would all be killed and the prizes burned, unless the city gave him what he wanted. And what he wanted was a chest of medicine. A chest of medicine. His crew, it seems, were sick, suffering from the diseases that ran through the close and filthy quarters of a crowded ship, and perhaps from the particular ailments that sailors caught in the ports they frequented, and he needed the drugs and remedies of an apothecary's chest to treat them. So this most fearsome of pirates, holding an entire wealthy city to ransom, asked only for a box of pills and powders and salves. It is one of the small strange windows the history opens, a glimpse of the ordinary mortal need behind the devil's mask, the captain worried for his sick men, holding a city hostage for the sake of their fevers and their sores. The city, of course, agreed. They had no choice. They gathered the chest of medicine, worth a fair sum, but nothing like the fortune Blackbeard might have demanded, and they sent it out to him. And there was a tense and dangerous interval while the exchange was arranged, a few days during which the pirates' messengers went ashore and lingered, and very nearly caused the whole bargain to collapse through delay and suspicion, days during which the prisoners must have wondered whether they would live. But in the end the medicine came, and Blackbeard kept his word more or less. He freed his prisoners, though he stripped them of their fine clothes and their valuables first, and set them ashore half naked, humiliated but alive. And then he lifted his blockade, gathered his fleet, and sailed away, leaving the richest city of the south shaken and astonished behind him. He had held an entire colonial port in the palm of his hand, and had asked it for medicine. There has never been anything quite like it before or since. It was the high water mark of his power. Never again would Blackbeard be so strong, so bold, so utterly beyond the reach of the law. And it is one of the deep patterns of these old lives, dear listener, that the very moment of greatest height is so often the moment just before the turn, the slack tide at the top of the flood, when the water hangs still for an instant, and then, very slowly, very slowly, very slowly, begins to draw back. For even as Blackbeard sailed away from Charleston in triumph, the forces that would destroy him were already gathering, and his own restless, calculating mind had already begun to turn toward a strange and surprising new course. Because almost immediately after the great triumph at Charleston, Blackbeard did something that has puzzled and fascinated those who study his life ever since. He broke up his own fleet. He destroyed the very source of his power. He ran his great flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, the floating fortress that had made him the terror of the sea, aground on a sandbar at the entrance to a place called Beaufort Inlet, on the coast of North Carolina, and there she stuck fast, and could not be got off, and was lost. And the question that has hung over this moment for 3 centuries is whether it was an accident or a plan. Did the great ship simply run aground by ill luck, as ships did in those treacherous shifting shoals? Or did Blackbeard deliberately wreck her, on purpose, as the first move in a cold and clever scheme? The evidence, gentle as it is, leans toward design. For at the very same time that the flagship was lost, a second of his ships was also separated from the company, and Blackbeard took the bulk of the treasure they had gathered, all the accumulated plunder of his raiding, and he loaded it into one small sloop. And then he did a thing that was, by the standards of the pirate world, a profound betrayal. He marooned a large part of his own crew. He took some of the men he trusted least, or wanted least, and put them ashore on a low and barren sandbar, a desolate spit of sand with no food and no fresh water, and left them there to die, or to be rescued by chance, while he sailed away with the treasure and a small hand-picked band of his most loyal followers. He had thinned his company down from hundreds of men to a few dozen, and concentrated all the wealth in his own hands, and freed himself from the great crowd of mouths and the great rabble of half-loyal followers that a big fleet required. Why? Why throw away the power he had spent 2 years building? The answer seems to be that Blackbeard, ever the calculating man, had seen which way the wind was beginning to blow, and had decided to get out of the pirates' trade while he still could, and to do it on his own terms, with his fortune secure and his old crew conveniently scattered, so that there would be fewer men to share the wealth and fewer mouths to tell tales. For the golden age of piracy was, by this time, beginning to close. The British Crown, which had for years tolerated and half ignored the pirates of the Caribbean, had at last decided to be rid of them. A new governor had been sent out to Nassau, a determined man named Woodes Rogers, with orders to break up the pirate republic, and he carried with him an offer of pardon to any pirate who would surrender and a promise of the gallows to any who would not. The free harbour was being closed, the republic was ending, and the wise men among the pirates were beginning to look about for a way to come ashore before the rope found them. Before we follow Blackbeard ashore into his strange retirement, let us linger a moment on one of the curious companions who had drifted into his story along the way, for he is one of the most peculiar figures of the whole Golden Age, and his presence beside the fearsome Blackbeard makes a kind of gentle, almost comic contrast in the midst of all this hardness. His name was Stede Bonnet, and he was, of all unlikely things, a gentleman. He was a man of property, a retired army major from the wealthy island of Barbados, the owner of a fine sugar plantation, a married man with children and a comfortable life, and every reason in the world to stay safely at home. And yet, in middle age, for reasons that no one has ever fully understood, Stede Bonnet threw all of it away and decided to become a pirate. He did it, moreover, in the most absurd manner imaginable. Most pirates came to their trade by stealing a ship and gathering a crew of desperate men. Stede Bonnet, being a gentleman with money, simply bought a ship. He purchased a fine sloop, fitted her out with guns at his own expense, and hired a crew, paying them wages out of his own pocket, which no real pirate ever did, since the whole point of piracy was that you took your pay from your plunder. He named his ship the Revenge, and he sailed out to rob and pillage, a soft-handed country gentleman who knew nothing whatever about sailing or fighting or the sea, playing at being a buccaneer. Some said he had gone mad. Some said he had fled an unhappy marriage and a nagging wife. Whatever the cause, the gentleman pirate cut a ridiculous and rather pitiable figure, blundering about the coast in his bought ship, getting himself badly wounded in his first real fight, barely able to command the rough men he had hired and who had no respect for him at all. And it was in this sorry condition that Stede Bonnet fell in with Blackbeard. The two captains met, and for a while sailed together in consort, and what happened between them tells us, once more, something of the cold and practical mind behind the smoking beard. Blackbeard saw at once that Bonnet was no sailor and no leader, and that his ship and crew were being wasted under such a man. So Blackbeard, with smooth and friendly words, suggested that Major Bonnet, being a gentleman unused to the hardships of a sailor's life, might prefer to come aboard Blackbeard's own ship as a guest, and rest, and leave the rough business of commanding the Revenge to one of Blackbeard's own officers. and the foolish, flattered Bonnet agreed. And so, by gentle persuasion rather than force, Blackbeard took over Bonnet's ship and crew, and kept the gentleman pirate aboard as a sort of pampered, powerless passenger, a guest who was in truth a prisoner, while he made use of the man's vessel as he pleased. It was a quiet, bloodless little theft, accomplished entirely with charm, and it is very much in keeping with the Blackbeard we have come to know, the man who preferred to take what he wanted through cleverness and fear rather than through slaughter. We shall return to poor Studdy Bonnet before the end, for his fate, like Blackbeard's, was drawing toward its close. But for now let us follow Blackbeard himself, who, having broken up his great fleet and marooned his surplus crew, and gathered all his treasure into one small sloop with a band of his most trusted men, now turned toward the shore, and toward the next phase of his strange career. For Blackbeard did not, in that summer of 1718, simply vanish into some hidden island lair, as the storybooks might have it. He did something far more interesting and far more revealing of the real world he lived in. He went to the authorities, and he surrendered, and he accepted the king's pardon, and he tried, for a little while at least, to become a respectable man. The place he chose for this transformation was the colony of North Carolina, and the small struggling town of Bath upon its shore, and the choice was a shrewd one. North Carolina in those days was the poorest and most lawless and most neglected of all the English colonies along that coast. It had a long, low, marshy shoreline broken by wide, shallow sounds and barrier islands, and a maze of inlets and creeks, country that was very hard for a stranger to navigate, and very easy for a man with local knowledge to hide in. Its towns were tiny and poor, its government was weak, underpaid, and, as we shall see, deeply corruptible. It was, in short, the perfect place for a pirate to come ashore and disappear into respectability. A place where the law was thin enough to bend, and the coastline was tangled enough to vanish into whenever bending the law was not enough. The governor of this poor colony was a man named Charles Eden, and it was to Governor Eden that Blackbeard went to surrender and claim his pardon. The king had offered that year a general pardon to all pirates who would give themselves up by a certain date and swear to give up their lawless life. And Blackbeard presented himself before Governor Eden and declared his repentance, and received the pardon, and became, on paper, a free and honest subject of the king, a former pirate now retired, his slate wiped clean of all his past crimes. He settled in the area, took a house, and for a few months at least played the part of a gentleman of leisure, living quietly on the fortune he had gathered at sea. He was even, the records say, married during this period to a young local woman in a ceremony performed by the governor himself, though the details of this marriage, like so much of his life, are clouded and uncertain, and there are darker stories told of his treatment of her that we cannot now confirm or wholly dismiss. But here is the thing about Blackbeard's retirement, the thing that shows us that the leopard had not truly changed his spots. It was a sham, or at the very least it was only ever half sincere. He had taken the pardon, yes, he had sworn to give up piracy, yes, but almost at once he was back at sea, taking ships again, robbing again, the old trade reasserting itself like water finding its level. And he could do this brazenly, more or less in the open, because he had made an arrangement, a comfortable and corrupt understanding, with the very men who were supposed to govern the colony and uphold the law. Governor Eden, and a powerful colonial official named Tobias Knight, who served as the colony's secretary and customs collector, appear to have entered into a quiet partnership with the pirate. Blackbeard would bring his plunder ashore. The officials would declare it legitimate salvage, lost goods lawfully recovered, and take their share. Everyone would profit, and no awkward questions would be asked. It was a snug little arrangement. A pirate and a governor and a customs man all dividing the spoils together. The law itself bought and turned into a partner in crime. And so Blackbeard, the pardoned and repentant former pirate, lived a strange double life through the summer and autumn of 1718. To the eye of the law he was a reformed man, a respectable settler. In truth, he was still a pirate, sallying out from the tangled inlets of the Carolina coast to take ships, then slipping back into the shelter of the Sounds where the corrupt government protected him, his plunder laundered into honest goods by the stroke of an official's pen. He gathered his men at a favourite anchorage near an island called Ocracoke, at one of the inlets through the barrier sands, and there he held court, and feasted, and drank, and entertained other pirates who came to visit him, and grew comfortable and perhaps a little careless, believing himself safe behind the wall of corruption he had built. But he was not safe, and the reason he was not safe lay not in his own poor colony of North Carolina, whose government he had bought, but to the north, in the neighbouring and far richer and far better governed colony of Virginia, where a determined and ambitious man was watching Blackbeard's doings with growing anger, and beginning, quietly, to plan his destruction. The man in Virginia who had set his mind upon Blackbeard's destruction was the lieutenant governor of that colony, a vigorous and able and rather imperious man named Alexander Spotswood. Spotswood governed the richest and most populous of the southern colonies, a place of great tobacco plantations and busy ports, and a far stronger and prouder government than poor little North Carolina to the south. And Spotswood looked upon the spectacle of a notorious pirate living openly just across the border, protected by a corrupt neighbouring government, preying upon the shipping of the coast that Virginia's own merchants depended upon, and he was filled with anger and alarm. He did not believe for a moment in Blackbeard's pardon or his reformation. He saw a dangerous criminal nesting on his doorstep, and he resolved to root him out, whether or not he had any lawful right to reach across the border into another colony's jurisdiction to do it. There was something personal in Spotswood's determination, something that went beyond the simple duty of suppressing piracy. He seems to have taken the existence of Blackbeard almost as an affront to good order itself, a stain upon the dignity of English government in America that he, Spotswood, would wipe away by his own initiative, and so, very quietly, because he did not want word to reach Blackbeard's friends in the Carolina government and give the pirate warning, Spotswood began to organise an expedition. He could not openly send Virginia's own forces marching into North Carolina, for that would have been a grave overstepping of his authority. So he worked through the Royal Navy. There were 2 small warships of the King's Navy stationed in Virginia's waters at that time, guarding the coast, and Spotswood arranged with their captains to lend men for a secret mission against the pirate. The ships of the Navy were too large to follow Blackbeard into the shallow, treacherous, ever-shifting waters of the Carolina Sounds, where the pirate lay snug behind the sandbars. So the plan was made to hire 2 small, light, shallow-drafted sloops, ordinary local vessels with no guns to speak of, and to crew them with picked sailors and officers from the Navy ships, and to send them slipping down the coast and into the Sounds to take Blackbeard by surprise in his lair. To lead this dangerous mission, command was given to a young naval officer, a lieutenant of the King's ship Pearl, a steady and resolute man named Robert Maynard. And it is around this man, Lieutenant Robert Maynard, and his small expedition of borrowed sloops and borrowed sailors, that the last act of Blackbeard's life now gathers itself. Maynard set out in the middle of November in the year 1718, with his 2 little sloops and his crew of perhaps 60 men, sailing south out of Virginia and down the long low coast toward the inlet at Ocracoke, where Blackbeard was known to be lying. It was a bold and risky venture. The sloops carried no cannon, only the small arms of the men, their muskets and pistols and cutlasses, while Blackbeard's vessel, though small, did carry guns. The waters were dangerous, full of hidden shoals where a ship could run aground in an instant, and Blackbeard, if he got warning, might slip away through the maze of channels and vanish, or might turn and fight with all the cornered fury of a man who knew that capture meant the gallows. Maynard had to find him and surprise him, and close with him before the pirate could use his guns or his knowledge of the local waters to escape. It was a great deal to ask, and the young lieutenant must have known, as he sailed south through the cold November days, that he was sailing toward either a great triumph or his own death. He came to the waters off Ocracoke on the evening of the 21st of November, and there, at last, Across the darkening water he saw his quarry. Blackbeard's sloop, the Adventure, lay at anchor in the inlet. The two forces had found each other. But the light was failing, and the channels between them were a deadly tangle of shifting sand, where a stranger's ship might run hard aground at any moment, and so Maynard, prudent and patient, did not attack at once. He anchored his sloops for the night, just out of reach, and waited for the dawn. And so the two enemies lay through the long November night, within sight of one another across the black water. Blackbeard and his men on the one side, Maynard and his on the other, each knowing that when the sun rose there would be a reckoning. We do not know how Blackbeard spent that night. The stories say he spent it as he often did, drinking and carousing with his men, careless and confident, perhaps not yet fully understanding the danger he was in, perhaps trusting too much in his own fearsome reputation to imagine that these strangers would really dare to close with him. But when the grey light of morning came up over the low water and the pale sand, the fight that would end his life began. The Battle of Ocracoke, when at last it came, on the morning of the 22nd of November, was a short and savage and terrible thing, crowded into perhaps an hour of confusion and blood. And we should tell it slowly, dear listener, not to dwell upon the cruelty of it, but because it is the climax toward which his whole strange life had been moving. And because in it the real Blackbeard, the man behind the smoke and the legend, fought and died like the formidable creature he truly was. When the morning came, Maynard weighed anchor and began to work his two sloops up the channel toward the pirate. And almost at once the danger of those waters showed itself, for the sloops, feeling their way through the unfamiliar shoals, ran aground on the sandbars. There was a desperate scrambling delay while the men threw their ballast and their water barrels overboard to lighten the vessels and float them off the sand, all the while drifting slowly toward the enemy. Blackbeard, seeing his attackers struggling, slipped his own anchor cable and tried to make his escape down the channel, and there was an exchange of words across the water, a kind of grim, defiant taunting that men shouted at one another before a sea fight. Maynard called out who he was and what he had come to do, and Blackbeard, by the account that has come down to us, cursed him and his men roundly, and swore a great oath that he would give them no quarter and ask none, that it would be a fight to the death between them. And then, as Maynard's lightened sloops at last came free of the sand and drew near, Blackbeard fired his cannon. That broadside very nearly ended the battle before it had truly begun, and it shows us why Maynard's mission was so perilous. Blackbeard's guns were loaded not with solid shot, but with the murderous scrap that men used at close range against a crowded deck, bits of iron and small shot and nails, a storm of jagged metal. It tore into Maynard's sloops and cut down a great many of his men in an instant, killing and wounding so many that one of his two sloops was effectively knocked out of the fight. Its commander killed, its survivors too few and too hurt to go on. On Maynard's own vessel the toll was dreadful as well, and in that moment, the moment of greatest danger, Lieutenant Maynard did a clever and a daring thing. He ordered most of his surviving men down below, into the hold of his sloop, out of sight, leaving only himself and one or two others on the open deck. He made his ship look like a slaughtered, beaten thing, a deck swept nearly empty by the broadside, a prize for the taking, and Blackbeard fell for it. For when the pirate saw the enemy deck lying still and empty, strewn with the dead, he believed that his single broadside had won the day, that the fight was all but over, that he had only to board the crippled enemy sloop and finish off the few survivors. And so Blackbeard brought his vessel alongside Maynard's and threw his grappling hooks, and lashed the two hulls together, and then, with a roar, he and his men swarmed across onto Maynard's deck, the great smoking, bearded figure of the pirate at their head, coming to claim a victory he thought already won. And that was the moment Maynard had been waiting for. He gave a shout, and from the hold beneath their feet his hidden men came pouring up onto the deck, fresh and armed and ready, springing the trap. The pirates, who had thought themselves the victors boarding a beaten enemy, found themselves instead surrounded, outnumbered, fighting for their lives on a deck suddenly full of armed men. And the real battle, hand to hand, cutlass against cutlass, pistol fired at arm's length, began. In the heart of that swirling, desperate melee, the two leaders found each other. Maynard and Blackbeard came face to face at last, the young naval lieutenant and the legendary pirate, and they fought. The accounts of their duel are the stuff of legend, and yet they rest on the testimony of men who were there, and the broad shape of them is most likely true. They fired their pistols at one another, and Maynard's ball struck the pirate. But Blackbeard, huge and powerful and filled with the fury of the fight, did not fall. They went at each other with their cutlasses, and in the clash of blades Blackbeard's heavy stroke shattered Maynard's sword, snapping the blade off near the hilt, and leaving the lieutenant nearly defenceless before the towering pirate. And in that instant, when Blackbeard drew back his cutlass to deliver the killing blow that would have ended Maynard's life, and perhaps turned the whole battle, one of Maynard's sailors struck the pirate a terrible blow across the neck from behind, a deep cut that staggered him at last. And here is the thing that fixed the legend of Blackbeard's death forever in the memory of the age, the detail that the men who fought there carried away with them, and told and retold until it passed into history. Blackbeard did not die easily. He did not die quickly. He fought on, terribly wounded, surrounded by enemies, his blood running from a dozen hurts, and still he stood, and still he swung his cutlass, and still it took the combined efforts of many men to bring him down. When at last his great body fell to the deck and the fight was over and his death was certain, the men who examined his corpse found upon it, the accounts tell us, some 5 musket ball wounds and some 20 cuts from blades, 5 shots and 20 slashes, and through all of them the man had gone on fighting, until the very life was hacked and shot out of him. Whatever else Blackbeard was, whatever cleverness and theatre lay behind the legend of his ferocity, in the end, on that bloody deck at Ocracoke, he proved that the ferocity was no mere act. He died as hard as any man who ever lived, fighting to the last breath, and the men who killed him never forgot it. With their captain dead, the surviving pirates lost heart, and the fight went out of them, and those who still lived threw down their arms and surrendered, or leapt into the water and were taken. The battle was over. Lieutenant Maynard had won, but at a fearful cost in blood, his little force shattered, many of his men dead or maimed. And now there remained only the grim aftermath, and one last terrible image that would carry the news of Blackbeard's end up and down the whole coast and into history. Maynard, to prove that the deed was truly done, and perhaps to claim the reward that had been offered for the pirate's death, and certainly to send a message to every other pirate and every doubting official along that coast, did a thing that was savage by our gentle modern lights, but entirely in keeping with the hard world of that age. He had Blackbeard's head cut from his body, and he hung that severed head from the bowsprit of his sloop, the long spar that thrust out from the bow, lashed there above the water for all to see, and so he sailed back north to Virginia, with the head of the most feared pirate in America swinging at his prow. The body, the stories say, was thrown into the sea, and the old legend grew up afterward, the kind of tale that gathers around such men, that the headless corpse swam several times around the ship before it sank, as if even in death the great vitality of Blackbeard would not easily let go of the world. That, surely, is only a story. But the head upon the bowsprit was real, and the sight of it, as Maynard sailed home, told everyone who saw it that the age of the great pirates was ending, and that the law had come at last, even to the tangled inlets where men had thought themselves beyond its reach. Now let us follow, slowly and gently, the threads that trailed away from that bloody morning at Ocracoke, the fates of the men and the matters that Blackbeard left behind him. For a life does not truly end at the moment of death. It goes on rippling outward for a long while afterward, in the lives it touched and the questions it left unanswered. And there is a quiet satisfaction in following those ripples to their stillness, the way one watches the rings spread and fade on the surface of a pond after the stone has long since sunk. The surviving members of Blackbeard's crew, the men who had thrown down their arms on that deck, were carried back to Virginia in chains, and there they were put on trial for their lives. The proceedings were grim, and the outcome, for most of them, was never really in doubt. Piracy was a hanging crime, and these were the followers of the most notorious pirate of the age, taken in arms in the very act of fighting the king's men. Most of them were condemned, and most of those condemned were hanged. Their bodies left to swing as a warning, the customary fate of the pirate who fell into the hands of the law. A few were spared. One or two were able to show that they had been forced into the pirate life against their will, or had joined Blackbeard's company only recently, and not of their own choosing, and these were pardoned. And there was one man among them whose fate touches on the darker corners of the story, a man who appears to have been an enslaved African in Blackbeard's crew, and whose particular fate the records leave shadowed, as they leave shadowed so much about the unnamed and the unfree who moved through these events without anyone troubling to write down what became of them. And what, you may be wondering, of the corrupt officials, the Governor Charles Eden and the customs man Tobias Knight, who had sheltered Blackbeard and shared in his plunder? This is one of the threads that does not end in tidy justice, and its untidiness is part of the truth of how the world really works, then as now. Governor Spotswood of Virginia, having destroyed the pirate, tried hard to destroy the pirate's protectors as well. Among the papers and goods recovered from Blackbeard's quarters, there were found, the accounts say, letters that seemed to show the complicity of Tobias Knight, evidence that the colonial secretary had been in correspondence with the pirate and had received goods from him. Spotswood pushed to have Knight brought to account. But Knight was a powerful man in his own colony, and the government of North Carolina closed ranks to protect its own. And when Knight was examined by the council of his colony, he was cleared of the charges and allowed to go free, though he was by then a sick man and did not live very much longer in any case. As for Governor Eden himself, he was never brought to justice at all. He remained governor of North Carolina, protected by his office and by the difficulty of one colony reaching into the affairs of another, until his death a few years later. The men who had grown rich off Blackbeard's crimes mostly kept their riches and their reputations, while the rough sailors who had done the actual robbing swung from the gallows. It is an old, old pattern, and we need not be surprised by it, only quietly note it as we pass. There remains the matter of the treasure, the great fortune that Blackbeard had gathered in his years of raiding and had so carefully concentrated into his own hands when he broke up his fleet and marooned his crew. Where did it go? The honest answer is that we do not fully know, and that the mystery has fed the dreams of treasure hunters for 300 years. When Blackbeard's quarters and his ship were searched after his death, a quantity of valuable goods was found, sugar and cocoa and bales of cotton and the like, the kind of bulky plundered cargo that a pirate took from merchant ships. But the great hoard of gold and silver that legend insists he must have buried somewhere, in some secret place known only to himself, was never found, and most likely never existed in the romantic form the stories imagine. Blackbeard himself, the tales say, once joked that only he and the devil knew where his treasure was hidden, and that the longest liver should take all. It is a fine line, and very much in his theatrical style, and it has sent generations of hopeful men digging in the sands of the Carolina and Virginia coasts, in search of chests of doubloons that were almost certainly never buried at all. The buried pirate treasure, the chest of gold marked with an X on a secret map, is one of the great romantic dreams of our culture, and Blackbeard's name is forever tangled in it, but the dream owes far more to later storytellers than to anything the real Edward Thatch ever did. The real plunder of piracy was mostly perishable cargo, quickly sold or spent or drunk away, not gold to be buried. The treasure, like so much of the legend, is mostly a beautiful invention. And what of poor Stede Bonnet, the gentleman pirate, whom we left as Blackbeard's pampered and powerless captive? His story too came to its end in that same season, and it is a sad and rather pitiful one. Bonnet, you will recall, had been eased out of the command of his own ship by Blackbeard's smooth persuasion and kept aboard as a useless guest. When Blackbeard broke up his fleet, Bonnet was set loose again, and the foolish gentleman, having taken the king's pardon along with the others, almost immediately went back to piracy, just as Blackbeard had, but with far less skill and far less luck. He cruised along the Carolina coast taking small prizes, a hapless amateur to the last, and he was hunted down, not long before Blackbeard met his own end, by an expedition sent out from the very city Blackbeard had once blockaded, from Charleston, led by a determined colonel named William Rhett. There was a long and desperate fight in a river mouth, with the ships running aground on the falling tide and firing at one another across the mud for hours, and in the end Bonnet was taken. He was carried to Charleston and put on trial, and despite a great deal of sympathy for his gentlemanly station and a dramatic escape and recapture, and many pleas for mercy, he was in the end condemned and hanged. The soft-handed planter who had thrown away a comfortable life to play at being a buccaneer, and who had found, at the end of his strange adventure, only the same rope that waited for the roughest sailor. There is something deeply melancholy in the story of Stede Bonnet, a man who seems to have been running from something in his own life, and who ran all the way to the gallows. So the season closed, and the great pirates fell, one after another, in those years around the end of Blackbeard's life. For the destruction of Blackbeard was not an isolated thing. It was part of a broad and deliberate campaign by the British Crown to crush piracy once and for all, and it succeeded. The free harbour at Nassau was taken in hand by its new governor and turned back into an orderly colony. Pirate after pirate was hunted down and killed or captured and hanged. The navy patrolled the sea lanes more thoroughly than before. The colonial governments, shamed and prodded out of their old tolerance, turned against the men they had once winked at, and within a very few years, the golden age of piracy, that brief wild flowering of sea robbery, was simply over, stamped out, finished. The men who had ruled the warm waters for a season were dead or scattered or hanged, and the great romance of piracy passed out of the real world and into the world of story, where it has flourished ever since, far more grandly in legend than it ever did in fact. Now that we have followed the whole arc of his life, from the smoky docks of Bristol to the bloody deck at Ocracoke, let us turn back, dear listener, and move more slowly still through some of the corners of his world that we passed too quickly the first time, the way a traveller who has hurried along a road by day will sometimes walk it again, more gently, in the cool of the evening, noticing now the things he missed. For there is a great deal more to understand about the world that made Blackbeard, the strange floating society he belonged to, and the way it really worked, far from the cannon smoke and the legend. And these are the kinds of quiet things, the textures and the customs, and the daily round of a vanished way of life, that make for the best of company on a long night, when there is nothing to be solved and nowhere to hurry to, and we may simply wander and wonder together. Consider, first, the ship itself, the small wooden world upon which all of these men lived. We speak easily of pirate ships, but it is worth pausing to feel what such a vessel really was, how small and how crowded and how alive with sound and motion. The sloops that the pirates favoured were not great towering galleons such as the Spanish treasure fleets sailed in. They were small, low, single-masted vessels, fast and nimble and shallow, built for speed and for slipping into waters where larger ships could not follow. A sloop might be only 50 or 60 feet long, and into that small space were packed dozens upon dozens of men, far more than a merchant ship of the same size would carry, because a pirate needed a large crew to overwhelm his prey and to man the prizes he took. The deck was crowded, the space below decks more crowded still, a dim, low, reeking, swaying world where men slept where they could, among the casks and the cargo and the cannon, breathing the thick air of so many bodies in so small a space. There was no privacy, no quiet, no escape from the constant company of one's fellows. A man lived his whole life, for the months of a voyage, within arm's reach of 40 or 60 others, in a wooden box pitching on the sea. And consider the sounds of that world, for the old sailing ship was never silent. A wooden ship under sail is a living, speaking thing, full of voices. There is the creak and groan of the timbers as the hull works against the sea, a deep, slow complaining that never stops. There is the singing and humming of the wind in the rigging, rising to a shriek in a gale and sinking to a soft moan in a light breeze. There is the slap and rush of the water along the hull, the heavy thud as the bow falls into a trough, the hiss of the wake streaming away behind. There is the creak of the great wooden blocks and the rasp of the ropes running through them, and the flap and thunder of the canvas when a sail is loosed or taken in, and over all of it the human sounds, the calls and the cursing and the singing of the men, the tramp of bare feet on the deck, the chant they raised together as they hauled on a line, all the voices of 40 or 60 men living their whole lives within those few wooden feet. It is, when you listen for it in the imagination, a strangely soothing music, the music of the old sailing world, a great slow-breathing thing of wind and water and wood, and a man who lived in the midst of it for years must have carried it always in his ears, even ashore, even in his dreams. Consider too what these men ate, and how they lived through the long days when there was no fighting to be done, for piracy was not all battle. It was, most of the time, waiting. The food aboard such a ship was poor and monotonous and often rotten. There was the hard ship's biscuit, baked so dry it would keep for months, which grew weevils in the warm damp of the tropics so that the men learned to tap it on the table before eating to knock the creatures out, or simply to eat it in the dark so as not to see what they were eating. There was salt beef and salt pork, preserved in brine in great casks, tough and overly salty and sometimes spoiled. There was dried peas and other such stores. And there was drink, a great deal of drink, for the water carried in casks grew foul and slimy within weeks, and so men drank it mixed with rum, or drank wine and beer and spirits whenever they could get them. And the pirate ships in particular were awash in liquor, for rum was a common plunder, and the men drank it freely, perhaps to dull the hardship and the boredom and the fear. Drunkenness was a constant feature of pirate life, and more than one pirate met his end, in battle or otherwise, the worse for drink. Blackbeard's own men were carousing the night before their captain's last fight, and that carelessness may have helped to doom them. The romantic image of the pirate is all action and adventure, but the reality was long stretches of boredom and discomfort, of bad food and worse water and too much rum, of waiting in the heat for a sail to appear on the horizon, broken only now and then by a few minutes of terror and violence. And yet, for all its hardship, the pirate life held a powerful attraction for the men who chose it. And to understand that attraction is to understand something deep about the age and about the men themselves, for consider the alternative. The ordinary sailor of that time, in the merchant service or the navy, lived a life of brutal hardship for almost no reward. He was paid a pittance, when he was paid at all, for owners and captains cheated their crews routinely. He was subject to a savage discipline, flogged for small offences, worked half to death, fed worse than the pirates fed themselves, and treated by his officers as something less than a man, a mere tool to be used up and thrown away. He had no voice, no rights, no share in anything. He was, in many ways, hardly more free than the enslaved men in the holds of the slave ships. And against that grim life, the pirate ship offered something that must have seemed, to a desperate man, almost like a vision of paradise. It offered a share of the plunder, an equal share or nearly so, real money, more than a sailor might earn in years of honest toil. It offered freedom from the brutal officers, for the pirates governed themselves. And above all, it offered a kind of dignity and a kind of voice that the ordinary world utterly denied to men of his station. For here is the thing about pirate society that most surprises those who learn of it for the first time, and it is worth dwelling upon, slowly, in the quiet of the night, for it is one of the genuinely remarkable facts of this history. The pirate ships were, by the standards of their own brutal and hierarchical age, astonishingly democratic. They governed themselves by agreement and by vote, in a way that the world ashore would not see for a very long time. When a band of men turned pirate, they drew up a set of rules, which they called their articles, and every man who joined the company signed or swore to these articles, agreeing to be bound by them. And the articles laid out, in plain terms, how the company would be run, how the plunder would be divided, what conduct was forbidden, and what punishments would follow a breach. They were, in their rough way, a written constitution, a social contract agreed among equals, and the men lived by them. And the division of plunder under these articles was strikingly fair. On a merchant or navy ship, the officers and owners took the lion's share, and the common sailors got almost nothing. On a pirate ship, the shares were nearly equal. The captain might take 2 shares, or 1.5, where an ordinary crewman took 1, and a few other officers took a little extra, but the gap was small, nothing like the vast gulf of the lawful world. Every man shared in the risk, and every man shared in the reward, more or less alike. There was even, in many companies, a kind of insurance, a fund set aside out of the common plunder to compensate a man who was maimed in the fighting, so much for the loss of a right arm, so much for a left, so much for a leg, so much for an eye. A careful little table of payments for the parts of a man's body that the work might cost him. In an age that cared nothing for the welfare of the labouring poor, the pirates had invented, out of their own rough sense of fairness, a primitive form of workers' compensation. It is a strange and moving thing to consider that these outlaws, these violent robbers, had built among themselves a fairer and more equal little society than the lawful world they had fled. And the captain himself, the figure we imagine as an absolute tyrant ruling his ship by terror, was in truth nothing of the kind, except in the one moment that mattered. The pirate captain was elected by the men, chosen by vote, and he could be turned out of his office by the same vote whenever the men lost confidence in him, as Hornigold was turned out, as we have seen. In the ordinary running of the ship, in the great decisions of where to sail and whom to attack, and how to divide the plunder, the captain often had no more say than any other man. One vote among many in the council of the whole company. His absolute authority was reserved for one circumstance only: the moment of battle or chase, when there was no time for debate and the ship's survival depended on instant obedience to a single will. In that one moment the captain commanded absolutely. At all other times he was a servant of the crew that had chosen him, and might be unmade by them as easily as he was made. To keep his place, a captain had to be successful, had to bring his men plunder and lead them to victory. For a captain who failed, who lost prizes or lost fights, or lost the men's confidence, would soon find himself voted down and replaced. The fearsome power of a man like Blackbeard rested, in the end, upon the continued willingness of his men to follow him, and that is a far more fragile and a far more interesting kind of power than the simple tyranny of legend. There was, alongside the captain, another officer in the pirate company, who held in some ways an even more important place, and whose existence is one of the surest signs of how seriously the pirates took their own rough democracy. This was the quartermaster. The quartermaster was elected by the crew specifically to represent their interests, to be a check upon the captain, almost a kind of magistrate of the common men. It was the quartermaster who took charge of the plunder and saw to its fair division. It was the quartermaster who settled the small disputes among the men. It was the quartermaster, often, who decided what should be done with a captured ship and her crew, who led the boarding party onto a prize, and who administered the punishments that the articles laid down. In many ways the captain commanded the ship in battle, and the quartermaster governed the company at all other times, the two offices balancing one another, the power divided so that no single man could become a tyrant over the rest. It was a careful, deliberate arrangement, born of men who had suffered under the unchecked tyranny of merchant and navy officers, and who were determined never to suffer it again, even from one of their own. When you understand all of this, the pirate begins to look like a rather different creature from the simple villain of the storybooks. He was a robber and a violent man, yes, and we should not romanticize the real cruelty and the real victims of his trade. But he was also, very often, a man in flight from a world that had treated him with great cruelty. A poor sailor escaping a life of floggings and starvation and contempt, seeking among the outlaws a freedom and a fairness and a voice that the lawful world denied him. The pirate ship was a kind of desperate experiment in living differently, a small floating republic of the dispossessed, and the men who joined it were voting, in the most emphatic way they knew, against the order of the world they had been born into. It does not excuse the robbery and the violence, but it explains a great deal, and it makes these long-dead men more human and more understandable and in a strange way more sympathetic than the snarling caricatures we have inherited. And Blackbeard himself, when we set him against this background, comes into clearer focus. He was a master of this world, a man who understood its rules perfectly and played them perfectly. He understood the power of reputation and built himself a fearsome image. He understood the loyalty of men and kept a band of followers devoted to him. He understood the value of fear over force and conquered far more by terror than by bloodshed. And he understood too when the game was ending, and tried, cleverly if not quite successfully, to slip out of it with his fortune and his life, to come ashore and become respectable before the rope found him. He very nearly managed it. Had he been a little more careful, a little less greedy, a little quicker to truly abandon the trade when he took the pardon, he might have lived out his days as a quiet settler on the Carolina coast, an old man with a comfortable fortune and a colourful past, dying in his bed with his strange history behind him. Instead, his own restlessness, his inability to leave the trade alone, drew the wrath of Spotswood down upon him and brought him to the bloody morning at Ocracoke. He was undone, in the end, not by any failure of his cleverness, but by the one thing his cleverness could not master, his own nature, the deep restlessness that would not let him be still and safe when there were still ships on the sea to be taken. Let us turn now to one of the most fascinating questions of all, the question of how a man who was a pirate for only about 2 years, who killed remarkably few people, who held a city to ransom for a chest of medicine, and was undone by his own restlessness, came to loom so impossibly large in the imagination of the world, so that 300 years later his name is known to children who have never heard of the kings and statesmen who ruled in his day. How did Edward Thatch, the Bristol sailor, become Blackbeard, the immortal pirate of legend? The answer lies partly in the man himself, in his genius for self-dramatization, his understanding that a fearsome image was the most valuable thing a pirate could own. But it lies even more in what happened after his death, in the stories that were told and the books that were written, in the slow alchemy by which a real and rather modest career was transmuted into a glittering myth. The single most important act in the making of the Blackbeard legend came just a few years after his death, with the publication, in London, of a book. It appeared in the year 1724, some 6 years after Blackbeard fell at Ocracoke, and it bore a long title in the fashion of the time, but it is best known by the short name of A General History of the Pirates. Its author gave his name as Captain Charles Johnson, and to this day no one is entirely certain who that author truly was, for the name appears to have been a pen name, and the real man behind it has never been positively identified, though scholars have made their guesses. Whoever he was, this Captain Johnson wrote a book that collected the lives of the great pirates of the Golden Age, Blackbeard and Bonnet and many others, telling their stories in vivid and dramatic and highly readable prose, and the book was an enormous success, and it became, for all the centuries that followed, the great source from which nearly all our knowledge and nearly all our legends of the pirates flow. It is a remarkable book, and a difficult one, because it is a maddening mixture of solid fact and pure invention, and it is not always easy to tell the one from the other. Captain Johnson clearly had access to real information, to court records and newspaper accounts, and perhaps the testimony of men who had been there, and much of what he wrote is true, or close to true. But he was also a storyteller, writing to entertain and to sell books, and he did not hesitate to improve a tale where improvement was wanted, to invent a dramatic speech, to add a colourful detail, to shape the rough clay of fact into a more pleasing form. It was Captain Johnson, more than anyone, who painted the great portrait of Blackbeard that we have inherited, The lit fuses and the braided beard, the brace of pistols, the wild and terrible aspect, the colourful anecdotes of his cruelty and his madness. Some of it is surely true, some of it is surely embroidered, and some of it we can no longer tell. The varnish and the portrait have grown together over 300 years until they cannot be wholly separated, and the legend of Blackbeard, as it has come down to us, is in large part the creation of this one mysterious author, writing a few years after the pirate's death, shaping a real man into an immortal character. And once Captain Johnson had set the legend going, it grew on its own, the way such things do, gathering to itself ever more inventions as the centuries passed. The pirates of legend acquired their buried treasure, and their treasure maps marked with an X, though the real pirates buried almost nothing. They acquired their walking of the plank, though there is little real evidence that the historical pirates ever made anyone walk a plank at all. They acquired their parrots and their wooden legs, and their cries of yo-ho-ho, their colourful speech and their islands and their endless romance, layer upon layer of it, deposited by novelists and playwrights and, in our own age, by the makers of films, each generation adding its own dreams to the figure, until the real men disappeared almost entirely beneath the accumulated gold leaf of 3 centuries of storytelling. The pirate of our imagination is a glorious creature, swashbuckling and free and faintly comic, an emblem of adventure and rebellion and the lure of the open sea. And he bears, by now, only the faintest resemblance to the hard, frightened, brutal, calculating men who actually sailed those warm waters for a few savage years and mostly died young at the end of a rope or a sword. Blackbeard stands at the very centre of this great romantic confection, the king of the pirates of legend, and it is worth asking, gently, why him? Why this particular man, out of all the pirates of the Golden Age, became the one whose name everyone remembers. There were pirates who took more plunder than he did. There were pirates who killed far more people. Cruel men whose real savagery far outran Blackbeard's careful theatre of terror. There were pirates whose careers lasted longer and ranged wider. And yet it is Blackbeard whose name has lasted. Blackbeard who has become the very type and symbol of the pirate, and the reason, I think, comes back to that one quality we have returned to again and again tonight, his genius for image, his understanding of theatre. The other pirates were simply violent men. Blackbeard was a violent man who understood how to make himself a legend, who deliberately crafted an unforgettable image, the smoking beard and the devil's aspect, and who thereby ensured that he would be remembered long after the others were forgotten. He built his own immortality, consciously, out of ribbons and slow match and careful cruelty, and it has lasted 300 years and shows no sign of fading. There is something almost admirable in it, in a strange way. The sheer artistry of his self-creation. He wanted to be the most frightening thing on the sea, and he made himself so, and the image he built has outlived empires. And now let us follow one last thread, a strange and wonderful one, that reaches all the way from Blackbeard's death down into our own time, and ties the legend back, at the very end, to solid and tangible fact. For the great ship that Blackbeard ran aground at Beaufort Inlet, the Queen Anne's Revenge, the floating fortress that had made him the terror of the coast, did not vanish from the world when she settled into the sand. She sank where she grounded, in the shallow water just off the inlet. And there she lay, slowly breaking apart, her timbers silting over, her cannon and her anchors, and all the scattered objects of her life sinking into the sand and the mud of the seafloor, forgotten, lost, for nearly 300 years. And then, in our own age, in the year 1996, divers searching those waters found a wreck, a great old wooden ship of the right age, lying in the shallow water near the inlet, crusted with the growth of centuries, her cannon and her anchors and her thousands of small objects scattered across the seabed. And after careful study, the experts came to believe, with growing confidence, that they had found her at last, the Queen Anne's Revenge herself, Blackbeard's own flagship, lying where she had grounded almost 300 years before. There is something deeply moving in this, dear listener, something that touches the very heart of why we tell these old stories at all. For 3 centuries Blackbeard had been a legend, a creature of books and tales, half real and half invented, his image grown so thick with myth that one might almost doubt he had ever truly walked the earth at all. And then, out of the sand of the seafloor, the divers began to bring up the real and solid objects of his real and solid life. They brought up cannon, the very guns he had mounted in the sides of the great ship. They brought up anchors. They brought up the small intimate things of shipboard life, fragments of pottery and glass, the brass instruments of navigation, a bell, the surgeon's tools even, the careful instruments of the ship's doctor, perhaps the very chest of medicine, or something like it, that he had held a city to ransom to obtain. They brought up gold dust, and bits of the cargo, and the 1,000 small witnesses of a real ship that had really sailed and really fought and really sunk. The legend for a moment became solid again. The smoke cleared, and there beneath it was the wood and the iron and the brass of a real ship that a real man had really commanded. And the objects, cleaned and preserved and studied, can be seen today in a museum in North Carolina, where anyone may go and stand before them and look upon the actual things that Blackbeard touched, and feel, across the gulf of 300 years, the strange electric nearness of a vanished life suddenly made real again. It is the kind of thing that makes history feel, for a moment, not like a story we tell, but like a place we might almost reach. Just there, just beyond the edge of our fingertips, the past brimming up through a hole in the sand of the seafloor. The real Blackbeard reaching out of his legend to touch us with a cannon and a bell and a surgeon's blade. And then the moment passes, and the objects are only objects again, behind their glass, and the man himself slips back into the unreachable distance where all the dead have gone, and we are left, as we always are, with only the story and the wondering and the quiet. Let us widen our gaze now in these last slow passages of the night, and look at the larger world in which Blackbeard's small fierce life was set, for a life is always lived inside a world, and the world of the early 1700s was a very particular place, and to feel it is to understand the man more deeply. Imagine the Atlantic Ocean in those years as a great busy highway of water, connecting the four corners of a new and expanding world. On its eastern shore lay Europe, old and crowded and quarrelsome, the seat of the great powers, England and France and Spain and the Dutch. Each of them reaching out across the water to seize and hold and exploit the riches of the lands beyond. On its western shore lay the Americas, vast and only partly known to the Europeans, their native peoples already shattered and dwindling under the diseases and the violence the newcomers had brought, their lands being carved up into the colonies and plantations of the European crowns. And to the south lay Africa, from whose shores the most terrible traffic of all flowed westward, the millions of enslaved human beings carried in chains across the ocean to labour and die on the plantations of the New World. All of this was bound together by ships, by the endless coming and going of vessels across the grey and green and blue water, carrying goods and people and wealth and misery in every direction, and it was upon this great web of seaborne trade that the pirate preyed, a small parasite upon the vast and growing body of Atlantic commerce. And what a strange and unequal and turbulent world it was, this early modern Atlantic. The wealth that flowed through it was immense, greater than anything the world had seen before. The sugar and the tobacco and the gold and the silver pouring back to Europe, and making merchants and planters and kings rich beyond the dreams of earlier ages. But the human cost of that wealth was beyond all reckoning, paid in the suffering of the enslaved and the dispossessed and the worked to death poor. The great hidden multitude whose labour and whose lives were the true price of all that glittering commerce. The colonies along the American coast, where Blackbeard did so much of his raiding, were rough and raw and new. Frontier settlements clinging to the edge of an enormous continent, their towns small and muddy, their governments weak and often corrupt, their people a restless mixture of the hopeful and the desperate and the cast off of the old world. It was a world in violent motion, a world being made and unmade at speed, a world where old certainties had been left behind across the ocean, and new ones had not yet hardened into place, and in such a world a bold and ruthless man might rise from nothing very fast, and fall just as fast. And that is exactly what Blackbeard did. Think, too, of how slow and how vast that world was, by the measure of our own hurried age, and there is a strange peace in the thinking of it. A letter sent from London to the colonies might take 2 months or 3 to cross the ocean, and as long to come back, so that a conversation across the water, a question and its answer, might take half a year to complete. News travelled at the speed of a sailing ship and no faster. A man who sailed from England to the Caribbean vanished, for all practical purposes, from the world he had left, and might not be heard from for a year or more, and might simply never be heard from again, swallowed by the sea or the fever or the violence of those far places, his fate unknown to his family forever. The world was enormous then, and the distances were real distances, measured in the long slow turning of weeks and months, and a man at sea was truly alone, truly beyond reach, in a way that we, who can speak across the whole world in an instant, can hardly any longer imagine. There is something almost restful in remembering it, a world so large and so slow, where the sea was wide enough to lose yourself in entirely, where a man might sail over the edge of the known and simply disappear into the blue distance, and no one could follow, and no one could call him back. Blackbeard lived in that vast slow world, and used its vastness, hiding in its tangled coasts, vanishing into its distances, and it was only when that world began, very slightly, to grow smaller and more governed, only when the long arm of the law grew just long enough to reach into the Carolina Sounds, that he was finally run down. And let us think gently about the particular places where his story was set, for they are real places, and most of them are still there, changed and yet the same, and there is a quiet pleasure in picturing them. Think of the warm islands of the Caribbean, strung like green jewels across the turquoise sea, the same sun beating down upon them now as then, the same trade winds blowing, the same clear water lapping the same pale beaches. Think of the island of New Providence and the harbour of Nassau, once the wild capital of the pirate republic, the reeking ramshackle town of drunken outlaws, now a bright and orderly place of a very different kind, though the same easy harbour still shelters the same blue water. Think of the long low coast of the Carolinas, the wide shallow sounds behind their barrier islands, the maze of channels and creeks and marshes where Blackbeard hid, the great slow brown rivers winding down to the sea through the cypress swamps. And think, above all, of Ocracoke, the low sandy island at the inlet where he met his end, a thin ribbon of sand and sea-grass between the Sound and the open ocean, where the wind never stops and the waves roll endlessly up the beach. It is a quiet place now, a place of fishermen and a few small houses and the long empty beaches, and the inlet where Blackbeard anchored on his last night still opens to the sea, and the water still runs through it on the tide, the same water, the same sand, the same wide sky under which he spent his final hours, all of it still there, waiting, patient, as the land and the sea are always patient, long after the men who fought and died upon them have gone down into the dark. There is a name that has clung to one spot near that inlet ever since, a place called Teacher's Hole, named for the pirate, the deep channel where his ship is said to have anchored, and where the legends say his headless ghost still swims on dark nights, searching the black water for the head that Maynard carried away. It is only a story, of course the kind of story that gathers around such a man and such a place, a shiver of the supernatural laid over the hard facts of his death, but it is a fitting one, somehow, and it speaks to the hold that Blackbeard has kept upon the imagination of the people who live along that coast, where his name is still spoken, where the children still know the tale, where the pirate has become a part of the very landscape, woven into the sand and the water and the long nights of that lonely shore. He wanted to be remembered, and frightening, and immortal, and on that thin island where he died he has gotten his wish more completely than perhaps anywhere else on earth, for there he is not merely history, but presence, a ghost in the channel, a name on the water, a shadow that the place itself will not let go. Let us return, one last time, before we let the night carry us off, to the man himself, to Edward Thatch behind the smoke and the legend, and let us sit with him a while in the quiet and wonder about the things the records cannot tell us. For when all the famous deeds are accounted for, the blockade and the great ship and the bloody death, there remains a man, an ordinary mortal man who was born and lived and felt and died, and about that inner man we know almost nothing. And into that not knowing we may pour a gentle wondering, the kind of soft idle wondering that is the very stuff of the long slow hours before sleep. What was he like, this Edward Thatch, when he was not playing the part of the devil for his trembling victims? What was his voice like, his ordinary speaking voice, when he was at ease among his men, telling a story or driving a bargain, or simply passing the long hours of a calm at sea? They said he could speak well, that there was something of education in him, and so we may imagine a man more thoughtful, more articulate than the snarling monster of legend, a man who had read something, who could turn a phrase, who understood men and how to move them. What did he think about, in the long watches of the night at sea, alone on his quarterdeck under the enormous stars, with the whole vast dark ocean breathing around him? Did he think of England, of the smoky streets of Bristol where he had been a boy, of the family he had left behind and perhaps never saw again? Did he ever doubt the road he had taken, ever wish for some other life, some quieter life, a small farm, a settled home, a family about him? Or was he simply wholly the thing he had made himself, the pirate, the legend, content in his terrible fame, asking nothing more of the world than the next ship and the next prize and the freedom of the open sea? We cannot know. The records are silent. The inner man went down into the dark with him at Ocracoke, and all we have are the deeds and the legend and the few hard facts, the outside of a life with the inside forever sealed. We know that he married, in those last months of his strange retirement at Bath, a young local woman, and the marriage is one of those small human facts that pierces through the legend and reminds us that he was, after all, a man like other men, who courted and wed and perhaps loved, or perhaps did not, for the darker stories told of that marriage hint at cruelty, and we cannot now tell the truth of it. But somewhere in North Carolina there was a young woman who became, however briefly and however strangely, the wife of the most feared pirate in America, and who was, within a few months of her wedding, his widow, left alone with whatever she had known of him, whatever tenderness or terror. And her story too is lost, swallowed by the silence that has closed over almost everyone in this history, except the great loud legend at its centre. There were so many lives tangled in his, the men who followed him, the women who knew him, the victims he robbed and frightened and let go, the corrupt officials who sheltered him, the enemies who hunted him down, a whole web of human beings whose fates crossed his for a moment and were marked by it forever, and almost all of them are now utterly forgotten, their names and their stories gone, leaving only the one great name, Blackbeard, ringing on through the centuries, while all the rest fell silent. And here, in the quiet, is perhaps the strangest and most thought-provoking truth of all, the one to carry with you down into sleep. Edward Thatch was a pirate for only about 2 years. 2 years out of a life of perhaps 40. For all the rest of his time on earth, the long childhood we cannot see, the years as a merchant sailor, the years as a privateer in the king's service, he was an ordinary man doing ordinary, or at least lawful, work. One among countless thousands of sailors who crossed and recrossed the sea and left no mark on history at all. It was only at the very end, in those last 2 crowded years, that he became Blackbeard, that he built his fearsome image and did his famous deeds and met his bloody death. 2 years of a life, and yet those 2 years have outshone and outlasted everything, have made his name immortal, have built around him a legend that has flourished for 3 centuries and will surely flourish for centuries more. It is a humbling and a curious thing to consider, how a life is remembered, how the long quiet stretches of it, the years and years of ordinary living, vanish without a trace, while a brief, bright, violent flaring at the end becomes the whole of what the world recalls. We remember the smoke and the beard and the bloody deck, and we forget the boy on the Bristol docks, the young sailor in the rigging, the long, ordinary years before the legend began. The man was so much more than the legend, and so much less of him survives. And that, too, is true of almost everyone who has ever lived, that we are remembered, if we are remembered at all, for only the smallest sliver of all that we were. The golden age of piracy, that brief wild season in which his whole story unfolded, was itself so short, when you stand back and look at it, hardly more than a single decade, a brief flaring between the end of one great war and the determined effort of the powers to stamp out the lawlessness that war had loosed. It blazed up suddenly, out of the thousands of fighting men cast adrift by the peace, and it burned fierce and bright for a few years across the warm waters of the Atlantic, and then it was put out, deliberately and thoroughly, hunted and hanged into extinction, and within a few years it was gone, as though it had never been, leaving behind only the legends and the buried treasure dreams and the great romantic shadow it has cast over all the centuries since. It is the way of such things, that the wildest and most romantic chapters of history are often the briefest, a sudden flowering that cannot last, a thing too free and too lawless to survive in a world that is always, slowly, slowly, growing more ordered and more governed and more tame. The pirates were the last free outlaws of the open sea, in the last age when the sea was wide enough and wild enough to hide them, and when that age ended, they ended with it, and nothing quite like them has ever come again. And so the great machine of the world, the slow, patient machine of law and commerce and government, ground on and closed over the brief wild gap in which the pirates had flourished, and the warm waters that had been theirs became, once more, merely the highways of honest trade, patrolled and policed and safe, or safe enough. The merchant ships sailed on, year after year, generation after generation, carrying their cargoes across the same blue water where Blackbeard had once spread his terror, and the memory of the pirates faded from a present danger into an old story, and then into a legend, and then into the half-comic. Half-glorious romance it has become for us, a thing of costumes and films and children's games, drained of all its real blood and fear, polished into pure adventure. The world moved on, as it always does, as it is moving on even now, even tonight, while you lie there in the dark and listen. The great slow tide of time carrying everything forward, the famous and the forgotten alike, all of it drifting on toward the same far quiet shore. Before we let the whole of it drift away into sleep, let us linger a little longer in that vanished world, and look at a few more of its quiet corners, for there is no hurry at all, and the night is long, and these soft wanderings through the old lost things are exactly the company that the long nights want. Let us speak gently of the flags that the pirates flew, for the flag was a part of the same theatre of fear that Blackbeard understood so well, a piece of cloth made into a weapon, and it is one of the most enduring images they have left us. The pirate flag of legend is the one we all know, the black flag with the white skull and the two crossed bones beneath it, the flag we call the Jolly Roger, and it flew, in one form or another, over many of the ships of that golden age. But the true history of the flag is richer and stranger than the single famous emblem suggests, for the pirates did not all fly the same design. Each captain, or many of them, had his own flag, his own particular device. A personal emblem of death stitched in white or red upon a black ground, meant to be run up the mast as a ship drew near her prey. A silent announcement of who was coming and what would happen if there was resistance. There were flags with skulls, and flags with whole skeletons, and flags with hourglasses to signify that the victim's time was running out, and flags with bleeding hearts, and flags with raised swords, and flags with the figure of death himself spearing a heart with a dart. The black flag was a call to surrender, a promise that quarter would be given to those who yielded peacefully. The red flag, the bloody flag, was the darker signal, the promise that no quarter would be given at all, that all aboard would die, and the simple raising of the right flag at the right moment was often enough all by itself to empty the courage out of a merchant crew and make them strike their colours without a fight, the cloth doing the work of the cannon, the fear doing the work of the blood. Blackbeard, of course, had his own flag, and the design attributed to him is one of the most striking of all, perfectly suited to the dark theatre of the man. It showed a horned skeleton, a figure of the devil himself, standing and holding in one hand a spear or dart pointed down at a red heart, the dripping heart of his victims, while in the other hand he held an hourglass, the running out of time, the warning that death was coming and coming soon. The devil, the heart, the hourglass, all of it stitched in white upon the black ground, a whole grim sermon of terror in a single banner, and we can imagine the cold dread that must have run through the crew of a merchant ship when that flag broke out at the masthead of the looming vessel bearing down upon them, and they knew, by the device alone, whose ship it was that had caught them, and understood that the smoking devil of the southern seas had come for them at last. Whether the historical Blackbeard truly flew exactly this flag, the records do not perfectly confirm, for here as everywhere the legend and the fact have grown together. But it is wholly in keeping with the man we have come to know, the master of fear, the artist of his own terrible image, and it has become inseparable from his memory. And Blackbeard, remember, was only one among many in that crowded brief season of piracy, the most famous, perhaps, but far from the only one, and it is worth meeting a few of his fellows, gently, in passing, for they fill out the picture of the age, and they are, every one of them, a story in themselves, a life flaring up and burning out in those same few years. There was Bartholomew Roberts, often called Black Bart, who came to the trade a little after Blackbeard, and who was, by the cold measure of plunder, far more successful, taking, the accounts say, some hundreds of ships in his career, more than any other pirate of the age, and who was unusual among that hard-drinking brotherhood for being himself a sober man who preferred tea to rum, and who dressed finely and kept a kind of stern order among his men, before he too was run down and killed by a king's warship. There was Charles Vane, a hard and treacherous pirate of Nassau, who refused the king's pardon when Hornigold and others took it, and sailed defiantly away rather than submit, and was at last shipwrecked and captured and hanged. There was the pirate they called Calico Jack, whose true name was John Rackham, a lesser figure remembered chiefly for the company he kept, and for the flag of skull and crossed swords that is so often shown today. For aboard Calico Jack's ship sailed two of the most remarkable figures of the whole Golden Age, two women who took up the pirate's trade in a world that gave women no place at all in such things, and whose story is one of the strangest and most striking of all. They were Anne Bonny and Mary Read, and they dressed as men, and fought as men, and sailed as men among the rough crew. And when at last their ship was taken, it was said that the two women fought on fiercely upon the deck, while the men, drunk and beaten, hid below, so that the women cursed their own crew for cowards. Both were captured and condemned, but both, it was found, were carrying children, and so both were spared the immediate gallows that took their fellows. Mary Read died not long after, of a fever in her prison. Anne Bonny's fate is uncertain, lost in the silence that swallows so many of these lives, though the stories say she may have been quietly released and lived on to an old age far from the sea. The fierce young pirate woman become, perhaps, a respectable matron with a secret past that no one quite believed. They are figures of legend now, these two women, and rightly so, for they broke every rule of their age, and their story has a wild, bright defiance to it that has kept it alive alongside Blackbeard's own. All of them, every one, the famous and the obscure, Blackbeard and Black Bart and Vane and Calico Jack and the two pirate women, and the thousands of nameless men who sailed beneath them, all of them were swept up together in that same brief wild season, and carried to the same few ends, the rope or the sword or the sea, almost none of them living long, almost all of them dying young and violently. Their careers measured not in decades but in a handful of years or even months. It was a brief, furious blaze of lawlessness, and it consumed nearly all who fed it, and when it had burned out, the survivors were few, and the dead were many, and the legend was born out of the ashes. To live as a pirate in that age was, almost certainly, to die as one, soon, and badly, and the men who chose it must mostly have known that, and chosen it anyway, weighing the short, wild, free life against the long, grinding servitude that was the only other thing the world offered them, and judging, in their desperation, that the short, wild life was worth the price. It is a hard bargain to understand from the comfort of a warm safe room 300 years away, but it was the bargain they made, and Blackbeard made it more boldly and more brilliantly than any of them, and paid it, in the end, in full, on the bloody deck at Ocracoke. And let us spend one last quiet while upon the small daily labours that filled the long stretches between the moments of terror. For it is in such ordinary things that the real texture of a vanished life is best felt, and there is something deeply soothing in the contemplation of patient, repetitive, unhurried work. Think of the great necessary chore that every wooden ship in those warm seas required again and again, the task they called careening. For a wooden hull, in the warm waters of the tropics, did not stay clean and fast for long. Within weeks the weeds began to grow upon it, long trailing green beards of marine growth, and the barnacles fastened themselves in their thousands to the planking, and the dreaded shipworm bored its tunnels into the very timbers, and all of this fouling slowed the ship and weakened her, until a fast pirate sloop grew sluggish and could no longer catch her prey or flee her enemies. And so, every few weeks or months, the ship had to be cleaned, and this was the great labour of careening. To careen a ship, the men would bring her into some quiet sheltered cove with a gently shelving beach, and they would unload her entirely, taking out the guns and the cargo and the stores and everything that could be moved, until she floated high and empty. And then, with ropes made fast to her masts and hauled from the shore, they would slowly pull her over onto her side in the shallows, careening her, laying her down until her hull was rolled half out of the water and exposed to the air. And then the men would set to work upon the bared hull, scraping away the weed and the barnacles with their tools, burning off the worst of the growth with flame, hammering fresh caulking of tarred rope into the seams where the planking had opened, smearing the cleaned wood with tallow and tar and pitch to protect it, mending and tending the great wooden body of the ship as a farmer tends his beasts. It was hard, hot, dirty, patient work, and it took days, and during it the ship was utterly helpless, rolled on her side and unable to fight or flee, so that a pirate careening his ship was at his most vulnerable, and chose his hidden cove with great care. And when the one side was clean, they would haul the ship over the other way and do it all again, until the whole hull was clean and sound, and the ship floated fresh and fast once more, and could be reloaded and sent back to sea. It was the slow, patient heartbeat of the seafaring life, this endless cleaning and mending, repeated over and over down all the years, and Blackbeard and his men knew it intimately, and spent many a long hot day at it, in the quiet coves of the islands and the Carolina coast. And think too of the ship's surgeon, that figure we glimpsed in the wreck off Beaufort Inlet, whose tools the divers brought up from the sand, for the surgeon held a strange and important place in that hard world, and his presence reminds us of how much suffering and sickness ran alongside the violence. A pirate ship valued a surgeon highly, and when they took a prize, a skilled surgeon among the captured men was a prize in himself, and was often pressed, willing or not, to join the pirate crew, for his skills could mean the difference between life and death for men who fought and who fell sick so often. The medicine of that age was a crude and painful thing, all bleeding and purging and the bone sore, the surgeon's chief art in battle being the swift amputation of a shattered limb before the rot could set in, done without any true relief from the agony save a swallow of rum and a leather strap to bite upon. And alongside the wounds there were the diseases, the fevers of the tropics, the bloody flux that ran through the crowded ships, the scurvy that rotted the gums and opened old wounds on men too long without fresh food, and the particular ailments that sailors caught in the rough ports, the very ailments that may have driven Blackbeard, to hold a city to ransom for that famous chest of medicine. Sickness was the constant, unglamorous companion of the seafaring life, killing far more sailors, in the end, than ever fell to shot or sword, and the surgeon with his dreadful tools was the only frail shield the men had against it. It is a sobering thing to remember, amid all the romance, how much of that life was simply suffering, quietly borne. In the dim, swaying dark below the decks, far from any help, on the wide, indifferent sea. Let us then drift back over the whole of it one final time, slowly, very slowly, very slowly, the way you might walk once more through the rooms of a house you are leaving, touching each thing gently in farewell. Let the whole long shape of his life pass before you now without any effort at all, as a kind of slow procession of soft images, and let it carry you down, image by image, toward the sleep that is waiting for you. See first the boy on the Bristol docks, small among the forest of masts, breathing the tar and the salt and the smoke, watching the ships come in from the ends of the earth, the whole wide world calling to him across the grey water. See him grow and go to sea. One more young sailor in the rigging, learning the long hard trade, the creak of the timbers and the song of the wind becoming the music of his whole life. See the great war come, and the young man become a privateer, sailing out of sun-blasted Jamaica to take the ships of the enemy under the king's blessing, learning to fight, learning to lead, learning that boldness and nerve could lift a poor man up out of nothing. See the war end, and the thousands of fighting men cast adrift, and the warm harbours filling with restless, dangerous idle men, and the slow, easy slide from lawful privateer into outright pirate, the paper torn up, the old loyalties forgotten, the free trade of robbery taken up in earnest. See him come to Nassau, to the wild, ramshackle pirate republic under its hard blue sky, the reeking town of tents and sailcloth and stolen ships, the harbour full of careened hulls and drunken outlaws, the one place on earth where no king's law could reach. See him fall in with old Hornigold, and learn the trade, and rise so fast that he has given a ship of his own, and become a captain. See the great Blackbeard begin to grow. See him braid it and ribbon it. See him tuck the smouldering match beneath his hat, and step into the cloud of his own slow smoke. See him build, piece by careful piece, the most frightening image on all the sea, the devil come up out of hell, the face that made strong men surrender without a fight. See him understand, as few of his fellows ever did, that fear was the great weapon, that a reputation was worth more than any cannon, that the smoke and the theatre could do what bloodshed could not. See him take the great French slave ship off St. Vincent, and cut her gun ports and mount her 40 guns, and crowd her with men, and name her the Queen Anne's Revenge, and make of her a floating fortress, and become, with her beneath him, the terror of the whole American coast. See him range up and down the sea lanes, taking prize after prize, his name running ahead of him like a cold wind. See him bring his fleet to the mouth of Charleston harbour, and simply stop the commerce of the richest city of the South, holding it hostage in the full light of day, and ask of it, of all the things in the world, only a chest of medicine for his sick men. See the medicine come, and the prisoners go free, half naked but alive, and the great pirate sail away in triumph, at the very height of his power, the most feared man on the sea. And then see the turn, the slow inevitable turning of the tide at the top of the flood. See him run the great ship aground at Beaufort Inlet by accident or by cold design, and lose her to the sand. See him gather all the treasure into one small sloop, and maroon his surplus crew on a barren spit of sand, and thin his great company down to a loyal few, and turn toward the shore. See him go to the poor corrupt colony of North Carolina, to the little town of Bath, and surrender, and take the king's pardon, and try for a few strange months to become a respectable man, even to marry, even to settle. And see how it was a sham, how he was back at sea almost at once, robbing again under the cover of his corrupt bargain with the governor and the customs man. The law itself bought and made his partner, while he grew comfortable and careless in his tangled coastal lair, and see to the north the angry, determined Governor Spotswood watching and planning, and at last sending out the young Lieutenant Maynard with his 2 small borrowed sloops and his 60 borrowed men, slipping down the coast in the cold November, hunting the pirate in his nest. See the 2 forces find each other across the darkening water off Ocracoke, and lie all night within sight of one another, waiting for the dawn. See the grey morning come, and the sloops run aground on the bars, and the desperate scramble to float them off, and Blackbeard's murderous broadside tearing into Maynard's crowded deck. See Maynard's clever trick, the men hidden below, the deck left looking like a slaughtered empty thing, and see the pirate fall for it, and board, and find himself sprung into a trap, surrounded by the men who came pouring up from the hold. See the 2 leaders meet at last in the heart of the fight, and fire, and clash, and see Blackbeard's stroke shatter Maynard's sword, and see the blow from behind that staggered the great pirate at the last, and see how hard he died, 5 shots and 20 cuts, and still he stood and fought until the life was hacked and shot out of him, dying as hard as any man who ever lived. See the head upon the bowsprit, and the sloop sailing home, and the news of it running up and down the coast, the age of the great pirates ending in that one bloody morning on the low brown water. And see, at the very last, the long centuries roll over all of it, the trials and the hangings, the corrupt officials going free, the treasure that was never truly buried, the legend growing up out of Captain Johnson's book, the smoke and the beard and the buried gold passing into story and song and the dreams of children, the real man vanishing beneath 300 years of gold leaf. And see, at the very end of all, the divers coming down through the green water onto the old wreck in the sand off Beaufort Inlet, and bringing up the cannon and the anchors and the bell and the surgeon's tools, the real solid things of the real ship, the legend made solid again for a moment, the past brimming up through the sand of the seafloor to touch us across 300 years, before it slips, once more, back into the unreachable dark. That is the whole of it, dear listener. That is the entire story of the man the world called Blackbeard, from the boy on the Bristol docks to the wreck in the Carolina sand, the rise and the height and the turn and the bloody end, and the long strange afterlife of the legend. A short life, a brief flaring, only a handful of years of real piracy at the end of it, and yet a name that has outlasted kings and will outlast us all. He wanted to be the most frightening thing on the sea, and he made himself so, and he wanted, perhaps without ever quite knowing it, to be remembered, and he is remembered, more completely and more lastingly than almost any king or saint or statesman of his age. This Bristol sailor who tied ribbons in his beard and lit smoke beneath his hat and frightened the world into immortality. And now there is nothing left to tell, and nothing left for you to do but rest. The story is finished. The ships are all anchored, the long voyage is over, the smoke has cleared from the water and drifted away on the night wind. There is no need to hold on to any of it now, no name to remember, no thread to follow, no ending still to come. It is all behind us, the whole of it, told and finished and laid quietly to rest, and the only thing remaining is the soft dark stillness of the room around you and the slow tide of your own breath. In and then out. In and then out. Carrying you gently down, let the warm slow water of 300 years close over the story now, the way the green sea closed over the old ship in the sand. Let the candle of the long night burn down to its quiet end. Let the wide black ocean of sleep, which is so much larger than any sea Blackbeard ever sailed, take you up softly and carry you out, far out, past the harbour lights, past the last low line of the land, into the deep calm dark where there is nothing at all to fear and nothing at all to do but drift and rest and let go. Good night, dear listener. Good night from quiet centuries where histories are told softly for the longest nights. May the slow, soft drift of these centuries carry you gently toward the morning. Sleep well, sleep deep. Good night.